want to say that I'm going to be talking a lot about planning because that's my discipline. And I know that I'm in a school of architecture and landscape architecture also. But I think many of the things that I'm talking about planning can be linked or thought of in that context as well. And so while I'm gonna sort of do a planning assessment and thinking here, it's definitely applicable to other disciplines. And I could change planning to your discipline in this. And so if this is not your discipline, please feel free to do that. And I think the process will be rewarding. I have Frida Kahlo up here in case anybody didn't know who this was. She is an inspiration to me. I grew up in New York City and I went to an arts high school there. And that's when I was first introduced to her. And so now I go on pilgrimages and things, try to get to every show I can. And one of the things that I've started doing is making sure that Frida appears in any presentation I do. And there's so many photographs of her and also her artwork that it seems like whatever the topic is, I can find something that's linked to it. And so in this case, I'm thinking about inclusion, cultural humility, justice, survivance, and sort of how do we commit to doing things differently. And one of the important processes is to really think about how we look at things, how we see things. And so I think this is appropriate, this picture of Frida, because she's looking at this prehispanic figure. And so I think the look that she's giving and how we have to really redo the way we look at things in many aspects is relevant here. So I'm gonna run through a couple of ideas. I'm gonna try to do things as quickly as possible just to make sure that we have time for talking about this. And that's where the knowledge is created in the conversation. I'm not really passing any knowledge on. I'm just sort of creating a context for knowledge creation to happen through conversation. So I will just get started. And also please feel free to interrupt if you have a question. It doesn't have to be at the end with the questions. If something I'm talking about doesn't clear, or if you want to like, oh my God, I need to ask you about this, please feel free. I'm not sure how it's going to work if you need a mic. And but if it's important, please feel free to interrupt. So we'll see if we can get this Prezi working here. I did a presentation the other day and it was a little funky. All right, looks like maybe we're going, okay. So one of the things that we have to do if we're going to embrace justice, and I have to say in the meetings that Daryl and I've been at, and many other conferences and committees I'm on the anti-racist committee for the School of the ACSP, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. It's a presidential committee. We're always having, we've been called to do this work over and over and over again. I think the summer of 2020 with the murder of many Black folks by police, including Floyd, that this was a catalyst that pushed it even more, but it's not new, really. I mean, people of color have been experiencing this for many, many decades and centuries even. So I think this is an opportunity to move on this stuff in a more, like we'll be listened to more at this point in time, because there has been a call to make changes. So what I want to do is sort of lay out a few things that I think can help us move, can help us make changes in the way that we do planning or architecture or landscape architecture. And I have some core questions that this is kind of be your homework. So I'm going to just lay it out now, go through some stuff, and then we'll come back to this. So these are questions that I think can be answered and move us and guide us in the way that we are going to re-see things, rethink things, re-practice things. So what are the underlying logics of planning? And I'm going to kind of answer some of these later on a little bit, not completely, but just give you a taste of how I think it can be done, not how it has to be done. But what are the underlying logics of planning? Who are the founding members of planning? And I'm talking about urban planning, but we could get in regional planning, all kinds of different planning. What are or were the belief systems that are embraced by these founding members and continuing sort of be embraced by important parts of planning faculty, planning practitioners, planning students? What are to be considered facts in planning? Which is a really, really important, like what is valued as data, what is not, how do we determine what facts are, by whom, and what are the values of our discipline? And so this question of facts and values sometimes are sort of pushed up against each other, but I think they're very much related and not so separate. I think they both inform one another. And then I have some other words around here that are really, I'm really thinking about values in particular, like reciprocity, objectivity, care, love, equity, rigor, and quantitative validity, right? And so thinking about there are many other words that could be here, but thinking about how these things relate to facts and values in the way we're thinking about planning and how we want to respond to this call to be anti-racist and to pursue justice within the field, within the pedagogy, within theory, all of that stuff. So I just want to lay this out just a little bit here, just because this is how I kind of think about planning canon. And I've often heard the fathers of urban planning as Burnham, Olmsted, Geddes, and Friedman. And even Friedman in someone, I don't know whether it was he himself or somebody referred to him as a father of urban planning. But I haven't heard about the mothers so much. So where are they? And people of color and non-US and non-European folks, how are they sort of missing, or as McKittrick talks about, have become unvisible or ungeographic? She's a great Black feminist geographer up in Canada. And so she talks a lot about how it's better to say unvisible rather than invisible, because we're not really invisible. We have been made, there's been a process to sort of cover up. So it's important to be specific about that. It's not that these folks are not there. It's not that they haven't been important, but it's that there's been sort of a covering up of what other folks are part of the canon or should be part of the canon. And so this is part of answering some of those questions, like really going deep down and who are those other people that we need to bring in there? Is Nanny Burroughs somebody who should be in this list? There's many other folks that we could add. So this is part of really thinking about and re-seeing what is it that we're doing for a canon in planning and how we need to reimagine it. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I can put in the chat open source article I wrote about this a couple of years ago, cultural humility as opposed to cultural competence. And one of the ways that we can see our roles as planners, architects, and landscape architects in communities, in classes, in practice, in theory, is bringing cultural humility or coming with cultural humility. And this is really, really important. And I do get some pushback on this because it's an attempt to engage in self-reflection constantly, to really evaluating the power positions that planners and whatever other discipline you're in has in relation not only to the communities that you might work in, but also with your colleagues, with students in your classes, in student groups. So really understanding how you as a person, your history, your identities, many markers we have, how that impacts your work with communities and the power balances that are inherent there, and then thinking about how to diminish them. So that doesn't mean that you necessarily walk into a community situation and hide your credentials as a planning professional, but it does mean that you really understand how those credentials impact your relationship and your power in relation to those folks in the room. And it's different from cultural competence, because cultural competence sort of suggests that you are able to become competent in someone else's culture. And that's kind of arrogant, and it's kind of not true. Like, you really can't, I mean, it would take years and years and years and years and years. And then even then, I would doubt that you could really be competent in the culture of someone else. And so I'm not saying not to sort of be sensitive and understanding, but the idea that you can learn about someone else's culture and be competent is not necessarily helpful. And so this comes out of social work, this idea of cultural humility, but I think it's really important for planning and other disciplines as well, when you're engaging not only with the public, but also in the academy. So I think this is an important concept that we can engage with and embrace, and it can help us look at things differently if we really come and bring our cultural humility with us. One of the things that I talk about in that article is the issue of locating yourself, or the process of locating yourself, as how to practice cultural humility. And I won't go into all the details, but I think here there are some questions. It comes out of this particular activity comes out of an organization called Novo. It's out of California. It's a group of folks that are saying no to violence. And they do a bunch of trainings. And one of their trainings is called Locating Yourself. And in the article that I'll put in the chat, there's more details about how it happens. But I do this with students often. You know, when I'm working, I do it with myself, with my colleagues, to really try to get to understand how we present in communities and how that impacts power. And, you know, power is so essential to how we do our work and how we learn and what we think. So we gotta always have that check on our power, and that comes from our identity and our experiences. It can change over time, obviously, but that's why we need to have to constantly be reflecting on this. So this is a great activity that folks might be interested in practicing in classes. It's also part of decolonizing. So the first slide where I had questions, we really need to think about our disciplines. Laura Harjo and Doris, I forget their first name, wrote an article 2021, I think. And in that article, they really talk about how the settler colonial, the long arm of settler colonialism is still so inherent in the way we think about planning, the theories of planning, the way that planning gets carried out, the way that planning gets taught. And so we really need to rethink all of those things, re-see, like Frida's doing here, re-see how our discipline is still being sort of handled or constrained, or I don't know, many more words you could think of, that it's still very much in there. So there's another activity in the article I have also, it's called What, So What, Now What? And it's a really a good way for people who are in the field to do some of that reflecting, not only on their own identities and how they work and how they come how they walk in a community space, or in a class space or in a hallway in the university, but also sort of how we're interpreting and thinking about information, and how we're working with that data. What are those facts? What are the values that are in those facts? And so I think it's really important to think about decolonizing as not only, changing out a few articles to be more inclusive of different voices in syllabi, and when people are writing papers or whatever, to have that decolonizing process, which is really important. It goes deeper, right? We need to think more comprehensively about what decolonizing really means. And so in that article of Laura Harjo's, they're really bringing in they're focusing on violence against Native women, which also is sort of a little bit tertiary to urban planning. I just had an article, Des Reject, from a journal that shall remain unnamed, but it's one of the planning journals. And we were talking about violence. It's a co-authored piece. We were talking about violence against Latinas and how that's sort of couched in the carceral system of, all this mass incarceration, the economic restructuring, and how that sort of results in all this violence. And that planners really need to think about that and make that a priority in terms of their planning cities, that's an issue. And Latinas are the biggest minority group now in the United States. And that one of the editors said that this was tertiary to planning. This wasn't really planning. So I think shifting ideas about what is planning and how do we make it more inclusive of different perspectives, different groups, different practices. And in Laura's article, she talks about a bed drop, a prison bed drop that they did. So they dropped all these prison beds in different parts of LA to really bring attention to the issue of incarceration of Native women. And they did beaded beds to really bring to the attention of the cultural sort of demonstrations and visualization of the violence against Indigenous women. And they had moccasin top, they had 16 pairs of moccasin tops that they did an artistic show all over the country. I don't know all the details of all the places that they went, but that again was to sort of bring attention to the really positive, beautiful things in Native culture, that it's not only about all the negative stuff, but that the women and girls who have disappeared and been murdered, that this is part of a much more beautiful culture. And so they're trying to get us to think about decolonizing planning in different ways than adding an article or two to a syllabus. So I think this is really, really important for us to help us to see things differently. And survivance is in the title, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this, and then we're going to go right back to those questions, and I'm going to be finishing up here. I know it's short, but I want to get to that conversation because I think it's really, really where the magic happens. But survivance is a Native American term that is talking about our presence in the Americas and our continued stories, our changing identities within those stories. And it's really about we're refusing to be a victim. We're refusing to understand ourselves as disappeared or unvisible. We're refusing to see our communities as tragedy. And it's not about just surviving. Survivance is much more thriving and celebration. And you hear a lot about Black joy these days. It's sort of a thing that we want to celebrate. We want to see that. We don't want to just see all the murders by police. We want to see the joy too. And survivance is kind of linked to that in some way. So this idea of survivance, and if planners can embrace this, if they can see that it's not, like you think about all the planning activities from the World Bank or the IMF, and they're doing food drops, right? And they're getting these terrible tasting biscuits, I've heard, to people. And so it's about survival. And I think there's definitely, you need to survive. You can't be in survivance if you have not survived, right? So those kinds of things are important. But I think we need to move our thinking and our plans, our long-range plans and our pedagogy to thinking more about survivance. It's not just how do we make the city better, but how do we really make the city a place of people thriving, many people thriving, not just certain groups of people thriving. And survivance, Vizenor's, you can get his book on this, but I think this is really, really an idea that can help us move our sights to see things differently for planners, and I think other disciplines can benefit as well for this. And so I'm going back to these questions. So I want us to think about this, and I wanted to hear if anybody in the audience has any answers to these questions. And it doesn't have to be about planning, it could be about another discipline. Anybody have any thoughts on this or questions about any of the cultural humility, survivance, decolonizing? These are really important themes that help us move. This would have been easier if I was there, I know.
But it's okay, you are still here. So with that, I would like to ask for a round of applause for Dr. Benson.
Thank you.
Questions? Or who has comments? Come on now, let's not be shy.
What are you thinking about these questions? Like, can you name some of the underlying logics of planning or your own discipline? What are they? What do people think those are? Like the unsaid but commonly acknowledged, or at least commonly agreed upon assumptions that have.
Okay, so I'm coming at this from a perspective of conservation. I'm not a planner, I'm a conservation student. Conservation, environmental conservation. But I think that the underlying logics map very well in terms of the origin of natural conservation as a discipline is in preserving the land for use by people, by white men, really, as an escape from the industrial world. And, as the perspective has become more ecologically focused in the conservation mainstream, not to say that there haven't been people who have been managing land in an ecologically focused way for hundreds or thousands of years very successfully. But in the Western conservation mainstream, that's the paradigm that is taken over. I think that a lot of the pitfalls that come in how we attack issues of environmental exploitation come from having not fully moved away from that foundational perspective of, Teddy Roosevelt and the national parks and preserving something for use. That's what I've been thinking about.
Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was wondering, I'd like to follow up on that comment, because I think the logics of natural resource conservation and resource management align significantly with the emergence of the planning field having to do with the regulation of land uses and the control of development in terms of particular impacts. And I just want to say thank you for this talk and this conversation. And I teach the history and theory curriculum in the regional planning program. So a lot of what you're saying resonates with what we talk about in the history and theory classes that I teach. But one of the things I was thinking is that when the focus on the environmental movement, Robert Gottlieb talks about this, the environmental movement focuses on predominantly the activities of white men who are trying to preserve wilderness and natural spaces for hunting, fishing, trapping, recreation, and so on. But there's a history of environmentalism that has urban industrial roots where women and people of color are much more figured, and that's not considered as much part of the canon. So there's that sort of hidden history or overlooked history where people who are making important contributions to the planning field aren't necessarily viewed as planners. So, so I think that's a theme that is in common between environmental conservation, but also urban and regional planning.
Right, totally. So let me just say that I've embarked in the last year and a half, 2 years, I'm in the School for the Environment. Half of my appointment is in the School for the Environment. So I've been pleasantly, in many ways, influenced and have started to do a lot more work on traditional ecological knowledge, which is sort of a new thing for me. I was just in Mexico for 7 months and started doing some work there, and I have a few proposals out. Who knows if they'll get funded. But one of the things that I think is important is to look back at when Europeans arrived here in the what is now the United States, Turtle Island for us. There's, and I can't think of the name of the guy who wrote it, but I can find it and I'll put it in here. He talks about, it was a 1994 chapter in a book, and he talks about cultural parallax. And in his case, he's talking about when the Europeans arrived, that they had the parallax, like what you can see through your camera, but it was cultural, and they could not see all the land management, the land preservation that Native people were already doing. They talked about this, the US, contemporary US lands as virgin, as untouched. And it's just, they could not understand because of their cultural background, their experiences, that there were lots of management happening. There were lots of practices around how to preserve. And we have the 7th generation ideology, which is not, across all Native groups, but many groups where we're intending to leave our spaces that we inhabit for whatever amount of time better than what we found them. And the other thing, there's a great chapter in one of Julian Arterman's books by Deborah McGregor, who's Anishinaabe. And she talks and it kind of blows the mind when I use this chapter in some of my classes. She talks about all our relations, and that if we think about ourselves as family to plants, to the built environment, that we're all relatives, then we think differently about how we engage with it. So we're not this extractive relationship. We're not this controlling and exploitative relationship. This is our family, and we have to treat nature and our built environment as our family. So we think about, if we take the idea of cultural parallax and understand that our vision, that the logics that underlie our vision of what's going on are tainted, and then we can sort of try to widen our parallax. But then if we can also change the way we think about our relationships, I think it's directly related to the question of how do we move. So I think, yes, Nubian, yep, that's him. You got it. Thank you. It was out of my mind, 95. So I think this is really, really important in planning, as it's becoming much more, I think, much more focused on the environment because of the crisis that we're facing. We've been facing, but I think planning is sort of copping on now, although many planners have been talking about it, but I think it's more widespread as a thing now in planning. But this is really important. We have to really get to what are the, the extractive policies, the who is deciding what policies are, what are the guiding forces that they're engaging with. A lot of it has to do with our economic system. It's really, really important. So thank you for that. I think that's really key. And I hope, as you're asking yourselves these questions, that you're being able to pull in more ideas of how do we sort of unpack this. And then once we understand all those logics, then we can try to challenge them. What else?
Hold on, Frank. I'm gonna give you my. Yeah, don't be hot. Oh, let me get.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for a great talk. I really love the concept of cultural humility and the non-paternalistic collaboration. And I think that's important. Like even, I mean, some feel kind of restrained, say where they came from, Europe, and whether they're back from whoever, Wilhelmistic or German Reich or other backgrounds. So their ideas were also much different than we have today too. So I feel like sometimes looking behind the thing and naming the planners that are even, I mean, we always look at these big names and always the same names, but as Mark pointed out, there are also unnoticed designers, planners, and there are women, minorities. So they had a great collaboration, but it's not being represented in the books. So we always read these books and I think, yeah, that is what planning is. So it's actually maybe not. So maybe question more, or look what's out there. What's other. Like, I mean, my current thing now is that, oh yeah, America's great. So Ukraine, yeah, help them have a war against Russia. What does it take? And I'm German, so for a German, it's important to have relationships with the Russians too, because they're just pretty close by. And I just feel like there is like that, and I don't want to like, I probably do, like there is that American kind of thing that, yeah, we know the thing, and I feel, I very often get very upset about that. So knowing the story and just, okay, intervene, kind of do the thing, how we think they are, but maybe that's part of the culture here. I don't know.
Part of the culture here.
So I think that gets right to that question about what are considered to be facts in planning. And let me just disclose that I lived in Russia for 2 years. I was in Ulan-Ude and Omsk. And so I have a very different understanding than many of my colleagues, friends, family about Russia. And so what I understand to be going on and my experiences there, which were pretty amazing, even though I was kicked out. And there was a big article in the front of Izvestnya, Shpionka ili feministka, is she a spy or a feminist? But that's a whole nother story. But I think it comes into, another thing that has been really important to me around this issue of what's facts, whose ideas, whose understandings, what perspectives are we engaging with, is this lack of, and I wrote an article about this, bringing bodies into planning. So when we think about facts, we're thinking about, we did a survey, we have a land use map here, we have, data that's been generated by the census, demographics. We have all these facts that are traditionally used when we're thinking about developing our, plans, with 5-year plan, comprehensive plan, whatever it is. But oftentimes real, feelings, emotions, sensations are not considered. And there was a group of Germans, by the way, in 2015, they wrote like 3 or 4 articles about how to include sort of bodily, experiences in spaces. And so they were using some sort of Fitbit type things to monitor people's heart rates when they went to a particular place. And they were encouraging us to use this data as part of emotions and sensations that are people are having in space. Feminist planners in Canada and Australia have been really talking about this for many, many decades. Maybe not many, maybe many decades. And I've been trying to push this too, but thinking about if we can add these emotions, sensations, and feelings and other ways of knowing, that could be a big boost to how we understand people's experiences in cities and how we can plan to incorporate more of that kind of stuff. And I've tried to help bring some methods that we can get at that. I do a lot of body map storytelling and other community mapping. There's a great group in Spain called Punt6, PUNT-6, who are doing lots of community mapping with youth, with women. And they have been really influential in how the city is doing sort of these 8 blocks of no cars in different parts of Barcelona. They're based in Barcelona. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to rethink facts and having different perspective on what's going on in Russia and how do we think about it and how do they think about it. And it's really, I think, difficult to get planners there, but I think there's a lot of desire at this point to really break it open and really, what did you say at the beginning, Daryl?
Burn it up or blow it up, one of the two.
So I think that's really, really important.
Thank you. Is there anyone online who has something?
Well, Mark just put in the chat, there is a body of current planning and design theory that discusses how our experiences of space and places are affective feeling as well as cognitive knowing. Totally. Yep, we need a lot more of that. And to value that data, because this whole quantitative qualitative division and the whole issue of being objective up here we have, and validity and all this, that restrains us to some extent. And it's sort of, I write about this too, that we just embrace it when it, can we really be objective? I mean, I know the answer, but I just feel like there's such a high premium placed on that when it's not really attainable. And if we can just acknowledge that and move on and understand the lack of objectivity and a lot of quantitative data, that we can do more to incorporate many different ways of knowing, different data sets that aren't necessarily traditionally embraced or valued. Getting back to values. What else?
Well, Betsy, could you go back to your Prezi with the names of the founding fathers, where you had a couple of questions?
Yeah.
And so what I like to point out, or at least to highlight by what you're saying, is that they're not invisible, but there were actually decisions made on reducing their value. So
Unvisible. This is Catherine McKittrick.
Right.
She's amazing. Unvisible.
So it's I hate to say it, but intentional, because when we talk about slavery, it is slavery versus the enslaved. Because if we look at slavery, it's only one side of the picture, but if we look at enslaved, you have to look at both sides. So in this case, if you were given the opportunity to teach a studio class in changing the framework of, let's just throw out rationality, because rationality does not exist. We're all human, we all have feelings, we all have preferences, we all have biases. How would you unpack a studio within a planning framework?
So how would I unpack a studio? Or do you mean like how, I guess I'm not understanding. Would
Or
I
how would your approach be as to
facilitate or develop or?
yeah, or to operate a planning studio for planning students in order to help them re-see as Frida Kahlo is doing?
Right. So I think the two activities that I mentioned, and I haven't put it in the chat, but I will put it in the chat, and then you'll have a lot more details. In this article I wrote on cultural humility, I have these two activities: the locating oneself, which I do in class, and then the what, so what, now what, and what do we know? That activity was developed, I think, by a Clark professor. I can't remember, but it's in the article. And so those two activities help everybody in the group in the studio to really do some self-reflection. And I don't think we do enough of that, because I'm all about the reflective practitioner. I think that's an awesome idea. Forrester and all of those guys, that's a great thing, to be able to not be stuck and be able to go back and reflect. But what they're actually not instructing us to do is to look at ourselves. They're asking us to look at the process and to go back and see what's happened, what might have gone wrong, where we might need to redirect, redo, but they're not actually asking us to think about ourselves and our identities and what we as individuals, as our bodies, our experiences, our actions, how those mark us and how those are seen by others. And so I think the idea of locating oneself and then really checking what we're hearing and what kind of data, if we're out in the community doing a project with a community organization or whoever it is, which is what our studios do. I don't know if all studios sort of do that. We have a client, being able to have space and time to do this reflection instead of, we got to get that, manual of the whatever it is, in one studio we did market research for what this community organization could do as a good business. Like, what would be the best options for them? Should they rent mopeds? Should they start doing green roofs? Whatever, we had a bunch of different possibilities that they were looking at. So instead of only focusing on that end product that you want to get back to the community, having, providing real space and time for this reflection, and that what do we know, all those activities of evaluating what our the what, so what, now what. Mark's helping me out here. Thank you, Mark. That is, really crucial to have those spaces available. And I guess there could be some other things, but one of the things I also do in most of my classes, I'm teaching with Ken Reardon right now, which is a blast. And he doesn't operate like this, so we're not doing it in this class. But I come often with no syllabus. I have my ideas, and I come with piles of books. I teach qualitative methods. I'll be doing that again in the fall. And I have a pile of books and articles that are theory, that are practice, and that are case studies. And then the first day of class, I ask everybody to go through and just browse and see what's interesting to you, and put a little sticky note if it's something you're interested in. I ask everybody to pick 2 things in each pile. And then sort of the class itself decides what are we gonna do in the class? What's the process? Are we gonna have everybody leads the class? Are we gonna have, what kind of deliverables are you interested in creating by the end of the class? So it's a much more, it's sort of a practice of how to engage and how I would want students to be engaging in a community, that this is a shared process. It's action research. It's really going to a place where everybody has a part in building this, whatever it is. And in that case, it's the syllabus. So I feel like that could be an important part of studio. And I haven't taught a studio for a very long time, but I have a feeling I will be soon, because Antonio wants a sabbatical and he teaches them.
Thank you for that. So is
What
there
about that?
So what, anyone else out here has a question? I'm coming on down. Here we go. Excuse me for a moment. Just going to walk on the back. I'll let you have it.
Thank you. Hello. So back to the question that was asked previously about the underlying logic of planning. I don't know too much about planning, but what I've been picking up is there's an importance placed on like the division of space and labeling space for specific uses, and it can be very exclusionary rather than inclusive, and it's like leans towards like creating both physical and non-physical barriers to both physical and non-physical spaces, and yeah, and it leads to like homogenizing communities rather than diversifying them, and that's just something that I've picked up on as something that has been in.
Yeah, that's super important. And Antonio Rizziti, who is my colleague here at UMass Boston, wrote an article 2021, I think it was, in JPER about the way that the sort of new urbanist community in Memphis, Tennessee. And in that community, there were certain structures and the way the buildings were made. And he worked with a group of African Americans, and they had a different community not too far from there, and it had kind of row houses, and I don't know, I don't remember all the details, but what ended up coming out of there was this idea, or the recognition in the research, that this new urbanist structure, which is like everybody should be loving new urbanism, because it's like, you know, you're walking, what's not to love? You're walkable, you have your schools, you have everything there. It's like, even Mahama, I was talking to her about new urbanism, and there's some guy who lives here in Newton, Massachusetts, where I am right now, who's very famous for writing about this. I can't think of his name either, but maybe Mark can help me out here. But it was the structure, the way that they designed it reminded people of plantations, and the way they had the streets made in, there was some sort of alleyways, those seemed to, they were dangerous to Black members of the community. And so we have this design of new urbanism, Emily Tollin and all those guys, and it's supposed to be universal, right? I even hate the word, I know architects and urban, or I've been talking about education now, the universal syllabus. And I got into a big discussion at one point with universal architecture, that issues of social, it can take care of disabilities, like you can have the fountain that moves up and down so everybody can, kids and people in wheelchairs, and you know, everybody can use it, so that's considered universal. But other things like social, economic, racial, gendered, a lot of other things don't get caught up in the universal. So I kind of don't like universal, but the idea of new urbanism as everybody should love it because it just makes so much sense, and the way that it's practiced is just not, it's not making it. There are people who are excluded in that. And of course, the exclusionary zoning, which is a huge issue not new. I mean, Davidoff was suing cities. I think 24 cases he sued across the United States against exclusionary zoning. I wish he would come here to Newton or some, not him, but his actually his daughter lives here, but someone needs to sue Newton, Massachusetts for their exclusionary zoning so they can make it better. But it is so important how we decide to use land. And so that's a great observation, and it's a critical point for planning theory and planning folks at all different parts of planning, transportation, housing, whatever it is, to really do some deep thinking and seeing things in new ways. Okay, Mark.
Any more questions out here?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Oh, I've got one right in front of me. Hold on. There you go.
I like it.
Hi, I had a question. So I don't have a planning background. I study natural resource conservation. But it sounds like the planning canon, very similarly, unfortunately, to most things, is very like Eurocentric and male-centered. And so I guess I was just wondering, is like locating yourself in cultural humility, do you think that's kind of a path to turn the unvisible visible, or do you think that's just, that won't work retroactively? It'll kind of only be for the future to kind of shift the point of view in a different direction?
Can you say the last part? Is it for this or that? Say those parts again, the last part. Is it for shifting more broadly?
Yeah, so do you think that like, is there any way to kind of make the unvisible from like the past of how planning has been? Is there any way to fix that, or can we just kind of look forward and hope that in the future it's different?
I'm a big fan of rewriting history to include a lot that was excluded, right? So I think there's a lot of people do planning history. So we need to have, I'm working on a book with Teresa Cordova to uncover all of the Latinas that have been involved in planning since like the 50s. We're cutting off in the 50s, like we're looking in San Antonio and Nueva York, in California, all of these places we're trying to make visible what Latinas have been doing in the planning world. So I think there's many opportunities for revisiting how we teach planning, how we understand the history of planning. So that's, I think, definitely necessary possibility. That's part of decolonizing as well. But I think to the future too, I mean, the present and the future, we need to really engage in a way that brings more voices in, more perspectives, different ways of thinking. It's just so, I've had so many, and this is still a bee in my bonnet. And I mentioned this earlier, that this article that we wrote was tangential to planning. I'm like, what do you mean? That's why there aren't that many articles on Latinas and women in this particular journal. And the editor is a woman. The guy who wrote us was a guy. And he did the Death Reject. But I just feel like we need to work now in sort of shifting how we're thinking, also the past, but then move it to the future, and make sure that when we're having studios, when we're doing our classes, when we're practicing in communities, that we're really we're doing this reflection. We're constantly looking to broaden things rather than narrow things. And this is, I don't know if people know Alexander, who's an emeritus faculty from Milwaukee. And I am still assistant professor. Hopefully that will change soon. But this was in 2010, and I was just starting to publish things. And I wrote an article about insurgent planning in Russia, in Ulan-Ude, with a colleague who is actually a history faculty. And he wrote a response, a letter to the editor saying that, this insurgent planning is really nothing. It's not really planning. If planning is everything, then planning is nothing. And he said that if we just change the word from planning, everywhere we say planning in the article, if we just change it to action, that nothing would change, and that we're really not talking about planning. And so I think there's a tension there, because when and Wei Ping Wu, who was the editor at the time, offered to let me write a letter in response, which I did. And then in 2016, in a little footnote in an article he published, he said she was right back in 2010 or 11, whatever it was. But I think the issue is that there's a tension of, we are profession, we have knowledge, we have our accreditations, we have our AICP, you know, after our name, we have been certified as planners. And therefore, in order to make that legitimate and keep that legitimate, we have to really narrow our understanding of what is planning and who is a planner. And in a lot of my work, I'm really trying to broaden that. I have an article on kitchen table planners. So I'm really trying to think about who is doing planning, and how do we make it more inclusive. But there's a tension, because there's like a sustainability thing or a self-interest. If we say that planning is everything, and then some people say then it's nothing, then that diminishes our power, diminishes our prestige as planners, as a thing, right? And so I'm not saying it's not important to have AICP or accreditation and all that stuff, but it's definitely a tension. And so I think that tension pushes some people to wanna make it narrower and limit who is considered a planner. And I mean, in this, we have a huge Davidoff project at UMass Boston that Ken and Antonio are working on. They're writing a book. And so they've done 30 interviews with friends, family. They have them up on the website. It's pretty cool. And it's called davidoff.org or com. I don't remember what it is. But anyway, so they've gotten more information about Susan, his wife, and how important she was to all the work that he did, right? And he's the father of advocacy planning. But now they've known through all these interviews that Susan was crucial, important. No, Linda, I'm sorry. Susan is, Linda is his wife, was his wife, that she was so important. So now they're starting to redo interviews and expand them to sort of Linda's circle. And they're going to have to rename the site, because it's clear she was so important to even things like helping deepen his analysis of power and how that was working in a lot of this stuff. So I think it's everything. It's past, present, future. It's how we're teaching, how we're theorizing, how we're practicing, how we relate with each other in departments. There's so much work to be done.
Anyone out in the internet land like Ellen Bader? Are your ears burning?
Is there smoke coming out?
All right, Ellen, I'll leave you alone.
Okay. Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Oh, let's hear it.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I'd love to talk with you sometime about this whole history, having been mentored by John Friedman and all. But I really love the way that you're talking about we need to bring people in. As some of my students will tell you, I start my classes with your emotions in this class are data. So we're going to always interrogate how you respond to whatever we're talking about, be it zoning or housing, because that's exactly what you're talking about how do we position ourselves. So I'd love to see that this is really becoming more formalized as a way of thinking.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I see a comment from Mark in here about frameworks of space and time. And time is so important. Like there's a Euro-US understanding of what time is. It's often very linear. And there's a great part of Laura Harjo's book, Spiral to the Stars, where she talks about bending time, and I think we can bend emotions, and this idea of bending time, it's not this sort of traditional US European approach to what time is, that it cannot seem logical that if I leave a bar and go to, she uses this in one of her talks, she's actually going to be our spring lecture. I'll send a note to Daryl, he can share with you. It's going to be virtual on March 31st at 4 p.m. It's a Thursday. We'd love to have you all come in and participate. It's going to be Zoom. But anyway, so she talks about how this guy leaves a bar and goes to another place, and another person leaves after him. But then when the guy gets to the other place, the person who left after him is already there. And it's normal, it's fine. It's not like it makes sense. It's not even a thing. And she talks about the way that we think about time, and particularly in her community, her Native community, that it's different, it's more open, we're thinking we're engaging with ancestors. Ancestors are really important. We're engaging with future generations. And that kind of changing up of time is really important. And Ellen's observation of how we need to formally bring these different perspectives in is spot on. Thank you.
Applause for Dr.